Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome tonight to Glover Cottages, both in person and by Zoom. We have an extensive audience by Zoom tonight, as far afield as California and South Africa, as well as all around Australia. And we're here to hear Professor Bob Carr address us on global climate diplomacy and Australia's role. A friend of mine observed to me last night that you only need to know two things about climate change. The world's getting hotter and Australia's not doing anything about it. But I'm hoping that tonight we'll have a much more nuanced and informative discussion than that. Our speaker, Professor Bob Carr, is, I think, well known to many of us. Following 5 years as director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at UTS, Professor Carr has been Professor of Industry in Climate and Business at the university since 2019. Prior to that, he was Australian Foreign Minister and served a long and distinguished period as Premier of New South Wales. Professor Carr will address us for around half an hour. After that, he'll respond to questions from our internet and live audience. Throughout his presentation and the discussion that follows, please log your questions using the Zoom Q&A function, or for those of you here at Glover Cottages, assemble at the microphone over there. So without further ado, Professor Bob Carr.
It's a great honour to be here, and my warm regards to members of the audience from outside Australia. And please don't hesitate to send me questions about any of my observations. I saw a reference recently from the Foreign Secretary of the UK. He was talking about Australia and climate. And Dominic Raab said his government would seek to, quote, encourage the best instincts of the Australians, unquote, on climate change ahead of the major international climate change conference in November. And I thought, this is something of a passage for my country, because I thought Australia was always on the right side. Australia was always with the good guys. Australia was a creative middle power that believed in decent values. To have us spoken of, almost, it could be said with a hint of condescension, as a country that needed to be especially appealed to, and appealed to over the heads of its leaders to the people to show their better instincts, was not the image I have or want for Australia. But I've got to say, Dominic Raab was well advised. Australia right now faces diplomatic isolation on climate policy. Our position goes against the letter and the spirit of the Paris Agreement. At the two forthcoming summits, the G7 and the April Leaders Climate Summit, we'll be the only developed country without a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. At the G7, the only country without that commitment. And the planets this year have suddenly aligned, which makes our isolation all the more dramatic. The US, China, the EU, the UK, Japan, having drawn together. And even with a James Webb Space Telescope, Australia can't be detected in that new alignment. We're simply not there. We've dialed our way out of this debate. The Biden administration is making the US the world leader on climate as it sees it, and putting climate at the centre of its diplomacy. The US president met Canada's PM to forge a North American partnership on climate, talking electric vehicles and green energy. But when it comes to Australia, John Kerry, the president's climate envoy, is reduced to saying that in a locution that tests his politeness, Australia and the US, quote, haven't been able to get on the same pages completely, unquote. Well, why shouldn't Australia? What's the barrier to Australian diplomacy being able to deliver our country a dialogue with our alliance partner on something America now sees as a security problem apart from anything else, climate? The United Kingdom declared after a review of defence and foreign policies that it would put climate at the centre of its foreign policies as it now seeks to define itself in a world role outside Europe. But Boris Johnson blocked Australia speaking at the UK-hosted summit last year because we weren't as committed as he thought Australia should be. Is this a triumph of Australian diplomacy? Is this us as a middle power maximising our impact in the world and pursuing a policy that reflects our values, the values of the Australian people? The EU has embraced a Green Deal as its economic recovery path. It will publish a proposal for carbon tariffs in June. It's declared it is, quote, ambitious and optimistic, unquote, about nations signing on for greater ambition out of COP26, with a focus on Article 6, which deals with carbon pricing. Australia took a decision in the Senate in late 2009 not to price carbon, and a coalition government in 2013 wiped it off the statute books. The tariffs the EU is committed to are designed to collect freeloaders like us and make them pay. We've never been able to approach international climate negotiations since 2013 saying we're bringing optimism and ambition to the table. Our trade partners, Japan, China, South Korea, last year made commitments to carbon neutrality by 2050, or in China's case, 2060. And while the specifics in China's 5-year plan released this month are disappointing because its 6% growth target for this year will erode the commitments to 18% emissions reduction, it's clear that China's response is a work in progress. And bureaucrats are going overtime to see that their president is not left stranded because of the commitments he made in September at the UN. That 5-year plan is likely to be fleshed out and updated. There is a simmering surprise addition to this list, and I'll come to it at the end of my presentation. But in all of this, Australia's given itself no diplomatic role. We're not leaders. No one could say that we've taken middle powers on board and are crafting a common climate response with them. That's an observation that could not be made on the basis of the evidence. Lacking a relationship with China, we've got no insights into China's work towards the summit at the end of the year, nor an opportunity to negotiate deals with Chinese businesses on solar panel manufacturing in particular, electric vehicles, and hydrogen. Why shouldn't we be engaged in the flurry of international diplomacy taking place in 2021 in nailing, for example, a hydrogen deal with China, getting in before others? Not possible. No diplomacy exists between us and China. Australia's international personality on climate places us with Saudi Arabia and Brazil. There is no hint of the middle power creativity we might imagine is Australia's natural diplomatic style. It leaves us particularly exposed with our friends in the Pacific. I want to use Robert Menzies' unforgettable phrase, "It is my melancholy duty," he said, declaring war in 1939. My melancholy duty is to say that I'm so appalled by our domestic record on climate. I've written twice to all the leaders of the Pacific Island Forum nations, making sure that they miss nothing about what we're doing on climate. We can't be allowed to get away with saying one thing domestically and another thing when we present ourselves at meetings of the PIC. And as a result, in February, I wrote letters to each of the Pacific Island community leaders, Pacific Island Forum, PIF, leaders, to spell out to them what Australia had done, including the Prime Minister on January 22nd ruling out new emissions reduction targets for 2030 and 2035, or the National Party leader releasing a policy for a new coal-fired power plant. This is deeply offensive to the leaders of Fiji, who are having to relocate communities now, other nations in the Pacific who are seeing their reefs destroyed because of warming ocean temperatures and their tourism sector threatened, and an existential threat, an immediate existential threat to Kiribati, where one can see seawater rising and in stormy weather threatening the quality of the drinking water on which the population of Kiribati must depend. Our Prime Minister can talk up a new 1,000 megawatt gas plant at Kurri Kurring in the Hunter Valley, offering no assurances it would only offer peaking gas rather than baseload gas, and not acknowledging no private company has expressed interest in constructing it, but not accept the responsibility this places on our shoulder when we talk to Pacific Island nations who know that our enthusiasm for gas and coal threatens their people's survival. I ask this question, what if things speed up? Nature doesn't obey our statutes. Nature is driven by statutes of its own. There are a number of tipping points being exposed. One is wild weather events, what happened in Texas, Californian megafires. Another is the loss of ice cover on the planet, the Greenland ice sheet, the Antarctic. Another is the inversion of the Gulf Stream. The plumes of methane leaking out of the disintegrating permafrost in Siberia, in the Yukon, is another tipping point threat. So it might be said, is the condition of our own reef. If the pace of change suddenly quickens, and it's reflected in the worsening suddenly of any of these indicators, what can we predict happening? I think I can see it clearly. One, a real revolt by the youth, especially in the developed world, who see their future at very real risk. Second, an acceleration in capital allocation by the world economy, with a total abandonment of fossil fuels by investment funds and other investors. Three, US and European coordination on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, that is, carbon tariffs, to force world pricing of carbon where it's not taking place. Four, an acceleration of international summitry with the goal of both strengthening and bringing forward medium-term commitments. That's pre-2050 commitments. And five, the Biden administration finding ways urgently of forcing the corporate sector to move beyond its goals for 2050. No existing corporate leader will be around when they're going to be tested, but forcing them to bring forward and rendered concrete in the current decade. In other words, taking the whip to Wall Street. These are the things that I can see happening if the tipping point comes in any of those areas of vulnerability. And any wise government in Canberra would be responding to normal cautionary principles, seeing that Australia was doing all it could to protect its people from that possibility. We no longer have the leave pass we had while Donald Trump was president. That's what's come to pass. And what's happening in the US is this president answering the question. is America still capable of leadership? By reaching for a demonstration of American leadership on climate. That explains so much about Biden, as does the personality of the president, about the fierceness of his commitment on climate. Some of my sources in Washington say even critics of Biden concede that he's got the right personality or temperament, persistence, a patient folksiness, as one said, and the best background to deal with the climate challenge. By best background, they were reflecting on years of painstaking deal-making in the Senate, 8 years as vice president, and a huge international network, all directed at forging a good agreement in Glasgow. For once, we've got the president for the hour. And the agenda is going to be busily set, beginning with his convened summit and the G7 meetings. And then in the lead up to the G20, a concerted effort to corral and goad laggard nations, with Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, playing a key role as the UN Special Envoy on Climate and Finance. The Great Reset now is very real. There are around 230 subnational governments in 46 countries across every continent engaged, as well as the leaders of national government. That means the city of New York, it means the state of California. There are a couple of things that stand out about Biden's program. One is this slow burn commitment made on January 27, his great day of action on climate. He said he'd given directives to the heads of agencies to identify any fossil fuel subsidies provided by any corner of the American government and close them down, so that, in his words, the president's words, quote, federal funding is not directly subsidizing fossil fuels, unquote. And he spelled out that no such subsidies are to appear in the budget request for the next fiscal year. Now, that is a huge commitment by a US president, and it simply takes any subsidies for fossil fuel out of the budget bids of government departments for the next financial year. The second thing that stands out for me is the likelihood that his climate envoy will recruit someone from the private sector to deal with the challenge of having companies that have made 2050 commitments being called on to account for their progress in this decade. And one method coming into view, I think likely to be taken up by the UK, is provided by an influential group of investors in London, calling on the UK government to mandate an annual vote by shareholders on the global warming policies of their corporations. And already one Australian company has been hit with a demand from shareholders that they endorse the same policy. This would build on the promise made by the UK Chancellor last year that by 2025, Britain would become the first country in the world to make large listed and private companies disclose the threats to their business from climate change. Why not wrap a requirement for an annual vote into the same package? Again, Australia is facing the people who control capital moving ahead of our expectations. What stands out about the European Green Deal, for me, thinking of implications for Australia, is the speed with which the notion of a carbon tariff gathered pace. When I spoke to an Australian diplomat late last year, his advice to me was that the architecture of a carbon tariff sponsored by the EU would be so difficult, it would be a couple of years away. All of a sudden, it's a recommendation from a committee of the EU Parliament, another measure of how quickly things here are moving. A carbon a carbon adjustment mechanism, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the details being worked on now, is designed to tackle carbon leakage while being WTO compliant. And the best description of it from a European perspective is provided by the President of the EU, President von der Leyen, at a Berlin energy emergency dialogue earlier this month. She put it this way. She said, let me return to the example of steel, one of the most traded commodities internationally. We want European companies to heavily invest in expensive technologies to make steel green. Green steel costs around 100 euros more per tonne than traditionally carbon heavy produced steel. So clearly we have to prevent cheap products from abroad undermining our effort. And this is why we will present a carbon border adjustment mechanism. With this mechanism, we'll impose a CO2 charge on certain products entering the European Union. We work so hard to reduce our emissions, we cannot accept to import at the same time emissions from abroad. Importing emissions from abroad is how Europe views products produced with no regard for their carbon contribution in other jurisdictions. Craig Emerson, even before that speech was given, wrote in the Financial Review in words that pick up this challenge. He says, the EU remains on a collision course with Australia. If we had our own effective emissions trading scheme, we'd be exempted from the European tariff, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But the Abbott government scrapped that, exposing Australian industry to punishing tariffs, not only in the EU, but in all countries being mooted as members of a possible climate customs union. They include Britain, the US, Japan, Korea, and possibly even China, which is committed to net zero emissions by 2060. What's the bet? He asked that China will bring forward that date to 2050 ahead of the COP26 meeting. So let me come to China. And I just ask the question I started with again, why isn't Australia in there negotiating with the EU, anticipating what they're doing in their parliament on carbon tariffs, protecting our interests, and being that creative middle power that in the back reaches of our minds, we've always imagined is Australia's role. Coming to China, there's no collective solution on climate that doesn't embrace climate. No collective agreement on climate that doesn't embrace China. And China's 5-year plan released this month with what I referred to as the disappointment of their target is driven by, one, their ambition to clinch their lead in renewables, which is an important part of what they used to refer to as China 2025. Second, the presence of its citizens, the pressure of its citizens for a cleaner environment, especially as China gets richer. And third, its aspirations for some level of global leadership. It's not being done to appease anticipated American pressure. I'm advised by a Hong Kong-based private sector economist that Chinese officials are working on the details necessary to implement President Xi's commitments made in September in his UN speech that go beyond what I would see as the limitations, the disappointing limitations of the 5-year plan, almost as if the officials had bedded down the 5-year plan documents when they heard their president get up addressing the UN, spelling out his 2060 commitment. China's big pension funds are working on asset realignment, shifting from brown to green assets in a way that reflects what has happened in Western finance. A titanic effort is going to be required of China to achieve, one, the growth of new energy, of renewables, and for reasons of national self-interest, one can view this as being the highest of priorities, with some Chinese sources talking about the biggest economic transformation since the very start of reform and opening up. And second, the pursuit of electrification, which will be achieved as the car fleet expands and China emerges as the biggest promoter of electric vehicles, but also as China scales back the steel industry. I was surprised to learn today that this year the size of the steel industry in China will be reduced by 2%. China getting out of heavy, old-fashioned manufacturing is an essential part of this narrative. I was interested that The Guardian, in commenting on the 5-year plan, said there is scope for China to flesh out its plan with more detail on how it will increase clean energy generation, encourage industry to reduce emissions, and adopt more stringent near-term targets on greenhouse gas emissions. Sectoral plans and other details will follow later this year. And I'm told by the business economist I managed to talk these things through with, that he expects China to settle on a national carbon target and distribute carbon targets to the provinces. Thus, I imagine meeting the EU test for whether it's pricing carbon to an extent necessary to avoid that EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. The big factor in what China will do is that Xi has staked his political capital and future on delivering green and low carbon growth at home, and his bureaucrats will have to deliver. That opens up the nature of negotiations between China and the US. I would deprecate any notion that Anchorage is the thematic or final word in the US-China bilateral. These are opening shots. And Biden, by allowing those negotiations to proceed in this fashion, has protected himself from the dreadful symbolism of having his first meeting with China appear to many in the US as being as compliant or as excessively cooperative as its critics say were the meetings with China of the Obama administration. Biden is now protected from that criticism by the way these talks went, and therefore liberated to see implemented by Kurt Campbell and others the China policy that the Biden team spoke about in the lead up to these elections. Remember Kurt Campbell's article in Foreign Affairs, competition without catastrophe, carving out areas of collaboration with China that included, he nominated, climate and pandemic management, while remaining wedded to competition on technology, a strong line on strategic questions like Taiwan and South China Sea, and a proud focus on human rights delineation, but nonetheless imbued with a belief that all of this president's aspirations on climate can only be met by co-opting all governments in the world, no matter how deeply one is committed to competition with them, in the case of China. But by the way, in this literature in which Americans rehearsed China policy in the lead up to this presidential election and rehearsed policy on climate, it was fascinating to me that while other allies were invoked, Australia got no mention. So, for example, in a Foreign Affairs article by James A. Baker III and George P. Shultz, calling for a US-led climate alliance, former Republican secretaries of state saying the US must provide leadership on climate. There was a commitment to a carbon customs alliance. And Schultz, the late George P. Schultz and James A. Baker nominated Japan, ASEAN, and South Korea, being recruited by America, to press China and India on climate. It was striking to me that they didn't mention Australia. Australia, the closest of US allies, couldn't be invoked. And it had me thinking, how did Baker and Schultz get it so right? How did they know us so well that somehow we had to be dropped from the list of likely US allies on climate? Republican secretaries of state, well beyond their years in office. They got that right. But so did the Democrats. In an article in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy for the Climate, that appeared in June last year, John Podesta, senior Democratic advisor and a co-author, mentioned Japan and New Zealand as natural partners of a Biden administration on climate. But again, being very close to the action in this country, they knew it was inappropriate to mention Australia. I'd say that says a lot about Australia's international personality. Today, we learned that the US climate envoy, Xi Jinping, will be meeting John Kerry. So in other words, in the immediate wake of Anchorage, the two climate envoys are going to be getting together. And I just ask the question, why shouldn't Australia be seeking a meeting with China's climate envoy? Should it be the natural state of things that we can't manage a dialogue with China on climate policy, even at this moment? Events moved with great speed in 2020. I thought COVID would dominate everything and climate would get relegated. But at the start of the year, Blackstone, huge investor, biggest investor in the world, made its commitment on climate. And by the end of the year, South Korea, Japan, and China made their big announcements by the end of the year. And of course, the first Tuesday in November saw the election of Joseph R. Biden. This is real dynamism. This is history in the making. This is dynamic, just like 1989 was dynamic, the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Marxist-Leninist governments in Eastern Europe. But this year is going to see no lessening. I learned today of the first signs of India about the shift, as if India feels, one, it must have self-reliance following the border clash with China last year. Two, its economy has got to avoid a collapse in the current account deficit because of massive importation of oil to support a combustion engine car fleet, as growth of 6% per annum sees that car fleet dramatically expand in numbers. And that India knows that part of its diplomatic armory has got to be a good global citizen. More than that, a good global leader. And sees part of its role in the world, a bit tentatively, to involve competition with China. There was even in the Bloomberg report a reference to India being drawn to saying we'll go for net zero emission by 2047 to celebrate its centenary of independence. It's hugely aspirational. And India is likely to say it can only pull this off with the support of the OECD membership of the developed world. But the International Energy Association only last month, in a 200-page review of Indian energy, concluded as its base scenario that India will be reaching peak coal-fired capacity as earlier as 2025. Remember, China right now is saying we'll reach that in 2030, although they might bring forward their assessment to 2025. as the work on fleshing out the 5-year plan is completed in the coming months. The background of this is an 18% drop in just a year in the cost of solar power. India is contemplating making itself a renewable superpower. Modi's concept of the country having energy security, of having proud self-reliance, is met by this aspiration. Achieving net zero emissions, says the Bloomberg report, would require India to set even more aggressive renewable energy targets, electrifying not only its transport sector, but most industrial processes, find solutions for hard-to-abate sectors like construction and agriculture, and dramatically boost commitments to reduce consumption of almost every conceivable product. Again, the question is, shouldn't Australia be in there? Shouldn't we be sharing our plans, our concepts, our plans for transformation to net zero emissions with India, and nailing the deals that see Australian business and Australian expertise providing the assistance that India is going to require? So in a year, in 12 months that have seen the election of Biden, the embrace by South Korea and Japan of net zero emissions by 2050, China say will get there in 2060, never having committed to such a process in the past, never even in 2015 at Paris being imagined as getting there. And then, of course, the election of Biden, with the priority he's giving to climate. This has been a year, a 12-month period of the most consequential change. But if India crosses that path and says, we will define ourselves by the boldness of our climate vision, you will see renewables grow as you've seen them grow nowhere else. With China and India dilating on competition to turn this thing around, the dynamism of this debate presents itself with all its challenge. I'll conclude with these words. I think it's intolerable for our international reputation as a wealthy nation and the world's 13th biggest economy, seriously interested in creative diplomacy, to decline to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. That would leave us as the only country present at the G7 meeting without such a commitment. Australia would be isolated, we'd be lonely, we'd be eccentric. Second, we must have serious midterm targets, especially if Biden is going to do that, if China is going to sharpen up its 5-year plan commitments to give itself a more credible 2030 target, especially as the Europeans are saying right now, we're giving ourselves a bolder target for 2030. And we've got in our bottom drawer a carbon tariff ready to be adopted. We should follow the US and the UK, moreover, in saying that climate is in fact at the centre of our diplomacy. The evidence has mounted since the 2020s. The evidence has mounted that the 2020s is going to be a crucial decade, and that the economic cost of 2 degrees warming would be a colossal burden for our continent. There's now a gap between our laggard approach and the policy energy coming out of Washington. Washington is saying any doubts about American leadership are going to be answered by the breadth and the thoroughness of this administration's response on climate. To be cast as laggard by our ally is an intolerable position for a country that speaks with such pride from time to time of punching above our weight. In climate, the world's biggest challenge, we've decided, it seems, to punch markedly below our weight. The damage to our international reputation from the enthusiasm of members of this cabinet has done, enthusiasm for old-fashioned carbon has done serious reputational damage to us in the Pacific, a region for which we have special regard. There must be a moment soon when our Prime Minister says to the soft denialists in his cabinet and party room, the world will not allow us to get away with this any longer. Leave aside any other arguments. Our diplomatic position, our personality in the world requires Australia to move.
Okay, who'd like to start the ball rolling? Someone here in the room? I can't see a hand raised anywhere. How about online? Please.
Thank you, Professor Carr, for your talk. As you said, our federal government is lagging behind in climate policy. I was wondering if you had any ideas of how the states are doing and if the states can kind of pick up the slack for where the federal government's missing. Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, there's interest in what sub-national governments can do on climate, and an association of them. Former Premier of South Australia, Mike Rann, is active at this level. They have a key role to play. And certainly Australia can be proud that state governments, Labor and Coalition, have signed up to net zero emissions by 2050. In New South Wales, it's a coalition government that's carving out renewable zones across the state to answer the big challenge, the challenge Europe and the United States are facing, the challenge that India and China are facing, of seeing that the diffuse producers of renewable energy can get their product into the grid and reach consumers in the big cities. That's the short answer. Our states lend us some hope and make Canberra's position all the more isolated.
Bob, thank you very much, Richard Bronowski. Just as the states have a role to play in trying to soften what I regard as a corrupt policy of our Commonwealth Minister for Energy and our Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the private sector has a role to play here too. Shareholders are objecting in carbon extract companies to continuing the policy that they have. And also the private sector is noted for its ingenuity, its inventiveness in Australia and abroad, especially abroad, which has a lot of ownership of company assets here in Australia. Surely this is going to force the government into some sort of reactive and cooperative approach in future. What's your comment on that?
Sure answer, Richard, is that the private sector is well ahead of the government. Business organisations, including those in agriculture, have made a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. Shareholder pressure counts a great deal. Shareholders sponsoring motions, including motions that there be an annual report, an annual report and an annual vote by shareholders on the adequacy of climate plans have an enormous impact. The gap between Canberra and the boardrooms is now pretty real.
Thank you, Professor Carr. Chris Skinner. Dr. Alan Finkel has just published a quarterly essay, Getting to Zero, where he looks at how one might achieve the zero emissions by 2050 in a practical sense. And it's very much about energy policy, which you have not really developed in your talk tonight. He says that all options for energy should be on the table, that there is a need for use of gas as an interim measure in order to totally remove fossil fuels in due course. But he also says nuclear is one of the options that should be considered on its economic merits. What do you think should be Australia's energy policy dealing with how to achieve that zero by 2050?
It would take another half hour to answer that, but let me home in on nuclear because it's always gets some attention. I get irritated. By the way, I've just picked up the Bill Gates book, and he's an unapologetic supporter of nuclear. In theory, nuclear gets us there. And I've always argued that. I've always been open to that. But I'm getting a bit sick of the debate in Australia because of two things. It is now woefully more expensive than the alternatives. Economics just kill it. So I would have been picking up the argument you hinted at about nuclear 5 or 10 years ago. Economics kill it today. And second, I'm not going to hear that it waste time having this debate in Australia. We cannot get development approval for a high temperature waste incinerator. On this whole continent, we still have not a single high temperature waste incinerator. A Royal Commission into handling nuclear waste in South Australia did not succeed in clearing the path for what seemed a pretty benign activity, allocating an area on dry land outside any earthquake zone, dry, stable land, little more than a few football fields in size, to take quantities of the world's nuclear waste, some of it produced by the use of Australian uranium. I would have thought a Premier might have presented that to the people of South Australia and got it endorsed as a new industry and a responsible one. Nothing doing. You cannot even, I've thought about this many times, but even in the shell of an old coal-fired power plant, say in the Hunter Valley, or one of the old brown coal burning plants in Victoria, you are most unlikely to get a local community or a state government saying, we'll grant development approval for nuclear power. I just think the cost and the impossibility of persuading any Australian community to sponsor one, illogical as it may be, means this is now wasted debate in Australia. If I were editor of the Financial Review or any other newspaper, I'd be saying, not another article making a theoretical case for nuclear. It's going nowhere on this continent.
We have an online question.
Yep, we have an online question from Ian Fry, and the question is, does the appointment of Matthias Cormann to the OECD have implications for Australia's position on climate change, particularly in the context of his antithesis to climate change in the past?
Matthias Cormann couldn't have been more prominent in opposing climate pricing and in flirting with climate denial. He had a key role. Marion Wilkinson's book, The Carbon Club, spelled it out in detail. It's interesting that the only way he was to get any part of the European OECD membership to contemplate him as their Secretary General was to say unequivocally, he supports net zero emissions by 2050. If Australia can't sponsor a candidacy in a world forum without shifting policy, what is the barrier to making net zero emissions by 2050, in fact, our national policy?
Next question, anything online?
Yeah, we have another online question from Catherine Tapley. Thank you for your insights. In light of your point around the people who control the capital moving ahead of Australian policy, what is your take on the Pitt inquiry and likely outcomes? Is this the moment Morrison uses to make the point to the soft denialists?
It could well be. It could be a trigger for him using a different form of words. I'm certain that in his department at the present time, there's a spectrum of verbiage that's being played with. Desirable to have net zero emissions by 2050. He's hopeful, optimistic, ambitious about it. I would say the world really requires us to endorse it unequivocally and use the language of the Biden administration or that eco-Tory Boris Johnson or of the European Union.
Bob, thank you for setting all of that out so we don't need convincing anyway, but convincingly. We still meet people out there, quite well-educated, intelligent people who don't believe a word of what you've said. And I try to work out where they're coming from and where they get their rigid rejectionist views from. And, you know, we find ourselves losing friends, as no doubt many others do. I suspect that some of the problem arises from the drip feed over decades of the Murdoch media, in which the front part of the paper, if you still read the paper, is devoted to denying everything that you've just said. And the back part of the paper, more recently, the business part, is actually saying the opposite. And some very sensible commentators there are pointing out the view of the states. So in a way, you have the feds in the front part of the Murdoch media and the states' views in the back part, where they are getting on with business and the corporations are in agreement with them and the shareholders and so on. Do you agree that this is part of the problem and that until we get rid of this foreign-owned influence in our society, we're going to be stuck in the position that you've described?
It's certainly true that News Corporation is the home of climate change denialism in Australia. It would not have had the force in our national life, particularly the influence over coalition policy and leadership, without the home that News Corp papers have provided. I think climate change denialism is an American invention that has taken off in Australia, partly through the influence of American think tanks, converting people like the former Senator Bernardi and Matthias Cormann to a climate change denialism, but overwhelmingly through the robust support of News Corporation tabloids and their broadsheet. I think climate change denial, soft and hard, two categories, is really impossible to grasp over the last 20 years without that media support it has had. In the US, I think the climate change denialism that runs so strongly out of Fox is, again, a large part of why it is a big strand of the American Republican Party and why a conservative ecological approach has not got off the ground in the United States, despite having a few articulate promoters.
We have time for one last online question.
Yep, this online question is, how can we as individuals take action to push the Australian government to move on their position and to jump on the bus of action to get to zero emissions by 2050?
Everyone has got their own way of exerting influence, access to a media voice, picking up the phone, talking to a talkback show. Put this down to the fact that I'm a political hack, joining the political party of your choice. Perhaps more realistically, organising 12, 15, 20 people in your electorate to go and see a coalition local member and say, we've got our electoral enrolment cards, we're all voting at the next election. We've got 4 big concerns about your government's climate policy. To start with, why can't we say there've got to be net zero emissions? And you could say to the local member of parliament, if it's valid, our delegation is younger than you. We think we're going to be on this earth a few decades after you pass on. We're getting really anxious about all the evidence of irreversible global warming. Now, can you not make a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050? What's the barrier your Prime Minister, your boss, has got here? That has a big impact. There aren't many MPs who wouldn't go back to Canberra and tell their leadership, listen, I'm getting real pushback from the young people in my electorate.
John, at lightning speed.
Thanks so much, Professor Carr. What packages do you think can pass Congress? And if we think of Joe Manchin, the Senator for West Virginia, and the focus on energy innovation, nuclear power, and negative emissions that have seemed central to his politics, what can you imagine getting through Congress? Thanks.
I don't think any of us knows. Certainly the relationship between the Biden White House and Senator Manchin's office would be fascinating. Which one of us wouldn't pay more than we pay to Netflix or Stan to have a full printout on those exchanges? So much depends on what this Democrat says and does. So I've got no idea. And I don't see anything in the American media that suggests anyone has. But a huge amount will depend on it. But still, the positive side is what this president can do by executive action. I hope the real answer to your question is Democrats winning seats in the Senate and the House in 2022. And all of you who've studied US politics know that that is a very hard ask.
Many thanks to our audience for joining us tonight and for such an interesting range of questions. We'll be continuing to have events of this kind twice a month over the next weeks, and our subjects will include the role of the middle class in China's future and US Middle East policy. On the alternate weeks, we'll be continuing to issue our newsletter columns from Glover Cottages. But to round off this evening, I invite Haley Wong, one of our interns, to move a vote of thanks.
On behalf of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, New South Wales, I'd like to thank Professor Bob Carr for coming and speaking to us tonight about international climate diplomacy and Australia's role. Professor Carr asked us, what if things speed up? And he painted a bleak picture of a world in which climate tipping points come sooner than expected, and Australia faces a real revolt from its youth and punitive measures from the EU and the US and our other partners with climate tariffs. He painted us as a laggard in the international community. In a dynamic year that was 2020, where South Korea, China, and Japan committed to new targets, and the Biden administration was elected in the US, pushing forward climate action globally. You gave us an insightful background into the situation in China and India, and you asked an insightful question, why aren't we in there? Why aren't we negotiating with China? Why aren't we negotiating with India as partners in a global push? And you said, if we are to be a dynamic middle power, like we see ourselves, if we are to be the good guys, then we'll exercise a normal cautious principle and we'll implement a net zero by 2050 commitment and appropriate intermediate targets, as well as following the UK and the US to push forward a climate-centered diplomacy. Thanks again for your remarks.